We will continue to explore the reasons why Nordic countries consistently lead international surveys regarding high levels of trust, happiness, gender equality, income equality, and today we'll be looking at Sweden as a case in point. We're grateful for the support and partnership of the Swedish consulate in creating this event, as well as the support of the Karl-Adam Bonnier Foundation, which has provided copies of David Crouch's book for distribution after the discussion. I'd personally like to thank Sally Yurkovich from the foundation, who's been instrumental in developing the program, and Ed Gallagher, our president, for his support of this series. Sweden is known for its top-ranked work-life balance. But what does work look like in Sweden, and how is time off and time on integrated into the work-life model itself? Moreover, how does the Swedish system successfully balance high wages, strong unions, regulated markets, and generous welfare, and yet still encourage creativity and innovation? Despite the welfare system's regulations, Sweden has managed to become a welcoming environment for entrepreneurs and innovation. We're fortunate to have three distinguished panelists with us tonight to discuss these questions. David Crouch is the author of Bumblebee Nation, the hidden story of the Swedish model. Mr. Crouch uses the bumblebee as a model. With a burly body and tiny wings, how can it fly? Like Sweden, which seems to defy the laws of economic gravity. In a few moments, Mr. Crouch will begin today's discussion with a keynote introduction about his own findings from his writings. Sarita Gupta is the director of the Future of Work and Workers at the Ford Foundation. She's nationally recognized for her insight into how the various economic, labor, and political issues affecting American working people proceed. She will provide the American perspective and insights into the future of work, informed by her experience working to improve worker conditions in the United States. Lena Sellgren is the chief economist and head of research at Business Sweden. Business Sweden keeps track of global markets and analyzes the effects of the global market on the internalization of Swedish companies. Our discussion today will be moderated by Elizabeth Walentin, Director of the Forum for Global Business at the Karl-Adam Bonnier Foundation. So what is the secret sauce of Swedish society's success? You can say that 5 times fast. Is it the Swedish management style that is characterized by consensus and flat hierarchy? Is it the close collaboration between government, unions, and the private sector? Perhaps it's the strong welfare system safety net that allows people to take risks and pursue novel business ideas. Or is it the generous parental leave and a subsidized childcare that provides flexibility in the job market? Or perhaps it's all of these and more. We will begin today's discussion with our first panelist, David Crouch, who will give us a brief discussion of his findings from his most recent book, Almost Perfect: How Sweden Works and What We Can Learn from It. Copies of the book are available as you leave the auditorium on the table in the back.
I think it's safe to say that the United States is pretty far from almost perfect. And so, you know, a lot of my reactions to reading the book, but even listening to you tonight, is that unfortunately that is not the reality for most working people, as you said, in the US, and especially with the most recent discourse about new technologies and automation. In fact, most of the US workforce are in fear of robots taking over. And rightfully so, because so much of the mainstream narrative has actually reinforced this idea that everybody is going to lose jobs, and that the only solutions that we can put out there are solutions that are about helping people just survive versus helping people actually thrive. And so when I listen to this idea of, you know, these job security agencies, it would be amazing if we could have an infrastructure like that built here in the United States, both because so much of the existing types of retraining and skilling work has been provided by the state in the US. But what that means is there's a gap between how employers are seeing jobs evolve and the kinds of skills that we need versus what is really being offered for workers. And I have met countless workers who have gone through reskilling and training, vocational education, et cetera, and can't actually find a job once they've finished. So, I think to me, we're in an exciting moment. It's a very hard moment in the United States and around the world with the changing nature of work right now. In the US, there's just tremendous what we call fissuring happening, which is the subcontracting and outsourcing of work. We're seeing a rise of precarious and low-wage work. In fact, there's a shrinking middle class in the United States, and much of that is due to declining bargaining power. Workers really don't have power in our economy. We're down to 10% of union membership in this country. So if workers don't actually have a voice in shaping the future, it means workers are literally on the menu versus at the table, being able to really make decisions and helping to shape what the future of work, what the future of our economy, our democracy can look like. And that's really what at the Ford Foundation we've been trying to solve for, is we focus on inequality, and we're clear that how we understand the experience of workers is so important to how we address the immense inequality that we're experiencing in our country today. And we're really hopeful as we get into the conversation to share some models of what we see are promising.
Thank you. Lena, tell us who's around your table there in Sweden, as you can give us some best practice examples there.
Yeah, first of all, I think it's so encouraging to have one who is actually not born and raised in Sweden like David, who actually give the perspective on the Swedish model. And listening in, I realized that this is something really good, because as was said here, when we are changing our societies, what it is about, I should say, moving more into the digital economy, we have challenges, but we can have a mind shift and see that this will probably help us in many aspects. But if you're afraid of losing your job and maybe you can have some challenges with this. But if we can help with this and the system that we have in Sweden, maybe you cannot take it to the US directly, but part of it, and we can have an exchange and collaborate around this as well. But I think there are three things to be mentioned for Sweden. Actually, the flexibility in the workforce, and we also have this solid welfare system, as has been explained as well. And the matter of fact that we have so large part of our population that is actually high skilled, well educated, which means that it's easier to take up and learn new things. So that's of course an advantage. And you asked for some examples. What do we have in Sweden? And we also have some companies doing good things, could be around the world as well, but helping with we have the job rotation. And that's something good, because then you can stay in your work position and just play around in different job positions where you can actually release or the potential that you have in the knowledge. Maybe you not need to be outside your workplace to get new knowledge.
And I want to return a little bit to what you said too about the worker's voice, because what's so interesting is Dave has just come from Washington, D.C. We've had a series of conversations there. Everywhere we've gone, there's been a full house. People are very interested in this. And again, the conversation tends to be about what the public sector should do versus what the private sector should do. What's the company's responsibility? What's the government's responsibility? And I think sometimes we lose sight of the worker's voice, and I think it's so important you bring that back to engaging them in this process, and beyond help from the labor unions. How do we do that? How do you really engage workers? And if any of you have any examples to share with that, I'm curious to hear. But I'll let you start there.
Sure. I mean, worker voice, actually the Ford Foundation purposely, we titled our program as the future of workers versus the future of work. because so much of the discourse in recent years has been about automation and has completely stripped the humanity out of the conversation, quite literally. So there's no, I mean, to your point, we don't have a strong welfare system in this country. Actually, most workers are dependent on their jobs and through their jobs, their employment, to receive benefits. Healthcare, for example, retirement benefits if they're lucky. And I mean, there's just such an immense decline in workers who actually have access to jobs that provide benefits. So the ability for us to reorient the conversation to say, what do we want the experience of working people to be in a moment of great transformation of work, of the economies, the global economy, and the introduction of new technologies. And there's many models of where when workers had the ability to take part in shaping those conversations, it was a win-win for everybody involved. And so I think a lot about examples of workplaces where, you know, automation is not new to work. It has been happening for decades and decades. I met with a gentleman in Chicago, Illinois. He worked at a factory manufacturing plant in Milwaukee, and he shared that because they had collective bargaining rights, they were able to sit with the employer and really talk through what a transformation, what an introduction of new technologies could look like, what it would take to adopt new technologies, how it should be adopted, and then which jobs, you know, he was very clear, much like you said, David, there are many trade unions who will say, actually, automation is not a bad thing in itself. The question is how it happens, and then who loses jobs, and how do we account for that and support workers through that? And there are countless examples of where workers being at the table have been very helpful. The other thing I'll say is there's a recent example of workers having voice that's worth lifting up. Some of you may have seen an article in Fast Company that just came out about workers at Toys R Us. Last year, some of you here in the US will remember that Toys R Us experienced bankruptcy, and over 800 stores were closed, millions of jobs were lost. And workers had been on the front line really negotiating with the private equity firm to get compensation for lost wages in that process. And it really set them up as new ownership has come in of Toys R Us, who've said, okay, we can't open 800 stores, but we want to have a new footprint, and we want to get your feedback and thinking on what the company could look like, a restructuring could look like moving forward. And the workers have just successfully created what they're calling a mirror board. But essentially, and I know this is going to sound funny because there are parts of, you know, in Sweden, certainly it's normal that workers would be on boards of corporations and be involved. That is not the norm in the United States. So the ability for workers to be in a conversation with the CEO and management and other important stakeholders to imagine what would be helpful for the company and for the workforce is a step in the right direction. So I think that's the type of innovation we're looking for. And then the last thing I'll say on worker voice is US labor law is very outdated. It doesn't actually speak to how work has shifted in this country. And so there's immense work to be done to support new policy and legal frameworks for what bargaining can look like, how workers can actually have a say in their workplace. And to me, that's really exciting, and much of the work of the Ford Foundation is investing in some of those types of innovations.
Thank you for that. Lena, I want to turn to your other hat. You have two hats. You've got your Business Sweden hat and your Advanced Manufacturing Initiative hat. 10 Swedish manufacturing companies, 10 American manufacturing companies. They come to the table. What kind of issues are they discussing? What are the challenges you're trying to address with it when it comes to reskilling in the future of work?
Yeah, first of all, you maybe don't know about the Advanced Manufacturing Initiative, do you? No, you couldn't, because we have not told you yet.
But now they'll find out.
Yeah, now to find out. No, but what we did, it goes back to the digital transformation of not least the industry. That's the focus. And then we found out that this is a huge question for the global economy or industry, of course. but in particular when it comes to Sweden and the US, and we see that there are synergies between our countries and our industries. So what we did was actually to gather 10 American, 10 Swedish companies within advanced manufacturing. So we invited the companies. We do this together with Business Sweden, my own organization, the Swedish Trade and Invest Council, and the American Embassy in Stockholm, Sweden, and American Chamber of Commerce in Stockholm as well. So we do this together, and what is the purpose? Why do this? That's to get them together with both the business sector and governmental representatives, of course, because maybe you have to change different rules when you are moving into this new digital economy. And the purpose is actually to strengthen the relation, of course, and help the companies. And Elizabeth asked me, what questions do they brought to the table? And we actually, at the first meeting, a bit more than a year ago when we launched this initiative, was actually not to have the strict agenda, because this is business driven. So we wanted the company representatives actually to tell what do they want, what do they need. So we said approximately this is about the challenges that we see, but what do you need? So then they brought up 3 different things. The first was test beds, where you can have the experimental open innovation solutions and see how can we collaborate, can we co-create. And the other was standards, because you need a system so you can actually work in a smooth way. And the last one was competence and skills. So that was the 3 main questions. And I think it brings us back to the question, what is this about? It's actually all about people and skills. And it's fun as well. Most of us want to learn. So I think it's moving in the right direction.
So it's something, when we're talking about this, what's so interesting about this challenge is it's exactly what you said, Sarita. It's a global challenge. It's something Sweden's grappling with, the US is grappling with, all countries are grappling with. One thing that makes this discussion hard when we come to the US is the statistic we learned in our conversations in Washington with Brookings, that 44% of American workers are considered low-wage workers. And David, you looked up a similar statistic for this for Sweden. What would it be if it's 44% of Americans are low-wage workers?
I'll give you a hint. It's lower.
It's lower. It's much lower.
Any guesses?
What it could be?
20?
10%.
10%? Radical. That's the radical. The radical voice here, actually it's 2.6%.
So yeah, that's a little bit of my question too, is with this difference in low-wage workers, the US having more of them, is Sweden's high-wage, higher percent of high-wage population in a way means we embrace automation a little better. Given that difference, you know, what can we learn from each other? Is what we're talking about in Sweden applicable to the US when we have such different statistics there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, we just have a rise of low-wage work, and it's something I want to really point out that's important to understand is, again, this work is without benefits. People are basically being forced. When we say these numbers, I just want to add like real life experiences to this. The number of people who serve food in our restaurants, for example, servers, they can't even put food on their own tables, most of them. They make a sub-minimum wage in this country, $2.13 an hour, right? Yes, we have what's called a tipped wage in this country. So they only make $2.13 and they depend on tips for the rest. Majority of these workers are women of color, young people who actually have to endure tremendous harassment in order to actually get the tips and then hope that they make enough at the end of the night. It's one, but many examples. In this country, we have exclusions of broad swaths of workers domestic workers, nannies, child care workers, nannies, housekeepers, are all excluded from the basic labor standards in this country. Excluded from minimum wage, overtime protections, no benefits, yet they are the people who do the work that makes all other work possible, right? But is completely undervalued. So when we talk about the Nordic model and we talk about the US, it is very hard to compare because the immense, it's worth saying these exclusions I'm talking about, many of them are actually rooted in a legacy of slavery in the United States. That when the New Deal was negotiated, the only way that we could have basic safety nets in place and win the New Deal was with an agreement that we would not touch the Southern economy and the workforces, which are largely Black workers. So that was domestic and agricultural workers. Why is this important today, and why do we see so much low-wage work? Because more and more workers are not finding permanent employment, but also they're being classified as independent contractors. So if you're an independent contractor in this country, you are also excluded from bargaining rights. You are also excluded from basic protections. So this conversation in the US is about flexibility and everybody, but what we say is there's flexibility that's voluntary flexibility, and then there's forced flexibility, which means most people who are working part-time jobs are actually working 3 or 4 jobs just to make ends meet. So in that context, how we think about the question of what we can draw from the model that David wrote about, that you're talking about, is frankly very difficult, given we don't have we don't have the investment in jobs, in good jobs, in the way that we need, which means what's coupled with that is the lack of investment in the kind of training and skills. It's connected for us in how we invest as a nation in our public education. Like it's connected to so many systemic problems in the US. That's not to say there aren't possibilities of what we can do moving forward, but it is a very different road that we would have to take. And part of it is deciding that we value human dignity, that we actually value that as a nation, that we would value that all people should be able to live, work, and age with dignity. But unfortunately, our public policies and our practices in this country do not actually lend us towards those set of values at the moment.
And you mentioned education. I want to bring it over there. You talk about this in Almost Perfect as well. So David, I'm going to maybe throw this one out at you. Sweden is a country where it's easier to take a leave of absence. It's easier to decide in mid-career that midlife, you just want to switch careers altogether. It's easier to start high school and do a vocational track and then change your mind and do a university track or go back and forth. And obviously we have in Sweden a more supported public education system, higher education system. Your reflections, David, when you looked into this, the education component of retraining, what you found in Almost Perfect and Bumblebee Nation.
I didn't really actually look into it in any great depth. I keep coming back in my mind, listening to this really interesting conversation. I keep coming back to the Reuben sandwich and the fact that this has got nothing to do with any political ideologies here, let alone left-wing ones. It makes economic sense to have a strong dialogue between the two sides. In the interviews, I got fantastic access for the book to people going right up to the people at the top of Swedish business and the industry. And one of them said, when he comes to the United States and talks about the involvement of trade unions in Swedish industry, people ask him, "What are you smoking?" Because to them the attitude is so different. In 1976, a law was brought in enabling or making it compulsory for the boards of private businesses to have trade union representatives. Up to a third of board members are trade union memberships are trade union representatives in the bigger companies. And I spoke to a very respected industrialist in my home city of Gothenburg, who remembers his father fulminating, saying, "Sweden's going to the dogs. It's going to end up. We're all going to, it's all going to go horribly wrong with the trade unions." And actually it didn't, and he was kind of semi-embarrassed to admit that in fact it's really helpful to have the unions on side in all sorts of ways. And you can see it being just an efficient way of running things. You waste so much time and effort dealing with tensions and disagreements with the workforce. And that all goes when there is a strong dialogue between the two sides and there's kind of trust. And that means some give and take, obviously. So maybe we should be talking about educating the employers in the United States and not the workers on this particular issue.
I think I want to let you speak to that, because I think both when it comes to educating employers and just the best practices within education in general, I think your organization's been doing a lot with that too. So,
With the education, you mean a little bit of?
or with both, yeah.
With both. Yeah, and I think also going back a little bit and think about what is it about and how can you actually learn even more, and where to start. And if you go back and compare different systems, I mean, in Sweden we have it's more in our DNA that we have chosen the model where we really protect not jobs, rather people. And that's what all our trade unions, they are very, very much of the favor for the fact that we do not protect jobs, we protect people. Which means that's also something that we do in Sweden. And it's hard to do the suggestions because it's a question of the society, the political system that you have in different countries. So to have any suggestions exactly how to do it, I think that's really, really hard. And when it comes to, as mentioned, this advanced manufacturing initiative, if we go back to this, that's also something that we would like to bring together, since one issue is this of skills, competence, education, and how you can actually educate and have an exchange, how you see different things. I think it makes sense when you interact and have the collaborations.
Sarita, I'm going to give you the last word before we open up. I know we have so many audience questions, so we're going to have a lot of dialogue for that. But now I'm curious, since we brought in an outsider here, you've read the book, or read some of the book, and heard anyway from David as well tonight. Where do you see the future of work, and is there anything that you think you could maybe incorporate from what you've heard tonight that could be a good inspiration for the U.S.?
Absolutely. So believe it or not, I feel very hopeful about the future after I shared all the realities of what working people are experiencing here. But I feel very hopeful because we are in a moment of great transformation, and I do think we are seeing the seeds of what is possible. So both, whether it's in the United States, many more workers that are in motion right now. Many of you may have been following the Fight for 15 sort of mobilizations, or teachers that have been striking across the country, and they're not striking for wages and working conditions only. They're striking because they're trying to make sure that there's an investment in public education in their cities or in their states. They're making sure that our children have access to nurses and librarians and support staff. And there's a new sort of energy that has emerged that I think is promising, because I do think policymakers are listening. I also think employers are listening. And so I think about examples like the care sector in this country. I use the example of a partnership as David, you were talking about sort of the relationship of employers with workers directly. You both referenced this. I think about Care.com and their negotiation with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. When Care.com first opened and created their platform, the wage for domestic workers was very low. It was equivalent to dog walkers. And the National Domestic Workers Alliance was able to engage with Care.com directly and say, here's why this is a problem. And can we be partners? Because you need a workforce, you need a strong care workforce in order for your business model to work. We need to create education, advancement, training opportunities. How can we partner? One, first off, let's set some better standards. And then two, let's actually educate, in the case of the care sector, employers who are people like you and me who may employ housekeepers or nannies or elder care providers to know what's the right thing to do. And let's think together about what an actual training program can look like. There's many more examples like that that are beginning to emerge, especially in sectors that I like to often refer to as where there's jobs of the future. Because healthcare sector, the care sector in general is one of many, education being another, where they are jobs of the future for us, given the demographic shifts in this country and the needs that we have. This is where we can invest and shift what have been bad quality jobs to good quality jobs. And that's where the opportunity is. So it's both looking at where we can make the shift from what have been bad to good quality jobs, but also in manufacturing, really thinking about what is possible in supporting the transition of work. And I'm fascinated by the job security agencies in relationship to the conversation happening in the US around climate change and what we're calling just transition of jobs that are in industries that will inevitably need to disappear. And how do you support that workforce? How do you support the transition of those communities? And the idea that we could bring some of this model into that conversation and help think about a holistic approach. And I love that it's about psychological support and training and the plethora of services that a person would receive. That's the sort of visioning that we can be doing. So I'm very hopeful of what's possible, and I do think it's going to take partnerships across many different stakeholders to find the sweet spot of how we make sure that we have a thriving economy, a thriving democracy, but also that we're really centering the dignity of people and all of that.
3 questions, which means 3 sentences, 1 per person. 1 sentence per person.
Correct me, did your book also address the surveys that were done in the last few years that Sweden is the happiest country in the world? Does your book address that? Also, we have a candidate running for president who believes in giving every adult man and woman in this country $1,000 a month. Now, you think that might be an interesting approach to your Nordic model, if we can get that?
All right, write that down. Let's get 2 more questions in there and you can answer them all at once. And then maybe we'll have time for more too, so don't worry if you don't get in the first 3.
There was an excellent point made up there about maybe we should look in this country towards changing our labor laws. So the question is, to what extent, after having studied labor laws in the US, might it be possible to implement some of the key strategies identified in the book? So if I take, for instance, an example of a labor law, that could be to do, with wages or, paid, compensation, doesn't matter, there's just such a whole, I'd never thought of it that way before. So the question is, to what extent, having studied the US labor laws, which I know you'll go off and do, can we translate this book into meaningful strategies.
Okay, and one more question for this round of questioning.
I just want to make a statement. The capitalists in Sweden seem to be nice people. Believe me, the capitalists in America are not nice people. Their view is pay the least wages. I mean, even the popes in 1890 had to write encyclicals to have the corporations, pay decent money. Nothing's changed.
Okay, let's get one more question. Thank you. Let's see, one question.
Thank you. So together with my business partner, we created a music festival in Gothenburg, Sweden called All My Friends Are Stars. And I was wondering what your perspective of the future of the role of the artist in society is, based on the new transition that we're going to be having with economy and work.
Good. Okay, three very distinct questions, and I'll let you guys see what you can tackle of that. David?
Those are really good questions, and one of the problems with writing a book is that people then think that you know the answers to all the questions. And certainly the question of the universal basic income and giving people, giving everybody a basic income regardless of whether or not they're in work. There's an experiment that was started in another Nordic country, in Finland, 2 years ago, and I confess I haven't followed it as closely as I should. Certainly it's been an inspirational experiment, and it's popping up in political proposals all over the place. And it makes sense in all sorts of ways, because if you put money in people's pockets, then they spend the money, and they spend the money on local businesses, which gets the economy moving, and it appeals to my personally to my sense that everybody should have a living income from some source or other, and that most people, in my experience, who are unemployed are not unemployed because they don't want to work. We all want gainful, interesting, productive, creative work, and whether that's in the artistic field or not. Personally, I want to see much more of it. I'm fascinated to learn that you've found a connection with my home city and found an environment there where you can launch a new festival. There already seem to be so many music festivals in Sweden. I don't know how you managed to create another one, frankly. And as for the capitalists being nice people, over to you, Lena.
Nice people. I don't know what to add to this, but I can add to the fact that when we are talking about this, and I think we are quite optimistic up on stage here, and looking into the future, we have another aspect that we are living much longer and longer, and hopefully healthier life as well. When it comes to jobs as well and the opportunities, I believe that in cultural sector as well as elderly care, health sector, all these. And when we're living longer, we need to entertain even more and all this. I think there are so many opportunities, and since we can also have these enabling technologies, we should not be afraid, because there are so many opportunities. So I didn't answer the question about the nice people in Sweden. The labor laws, maybe for you.
Yes, a few things. I would say, I do want to go back to the candidate question and the UBI question. I think there's been many evolutions of that idea in the public discourse in the US. And one thing I would say is, the concern I have is that it's talked about and thought of as a solution in addition to a whole other host of solutions that we need. It cannot be seen as the silver bullet in addressing what are really the pain points that people are experiencing today. Money in their pocket is important and necessary, but we have to actually address a broader set of macroeconomic trends in the US. Everything from the fact that we've had over 3 decades of wage stagnation in this country while productivity has gone up, the fact that we need more good quality jobs in this country with benefits, a stronger safety net, and a real conversation about distribution of wealth. I mean, automation and technology will create wealth. There is no law that is going to govern whether that wealth will be used to create more economic mobility in this country or not. And those are the conversations we really need to make sure we're getting at and figuring out solutions around. On the labor law question, it's a great question. I'll say I've been part of a project that has been taking place at Harvard University Law School, and it's called the Clean Slate Project. And essentially, a number of us gathered to say, given the shifting nature of work and the economy and realities, what is the new set of labor laws that we need? And some things I would draw from Sweden and what I read in David's book. One is, there's a really active conversation about the need for sectoral bargaining in the United States, which is not what we have. The United States has, this is a little wonky, is like enterprise-based bargaining. It's not sectoral-based bargaining. Sectoral-based bargaining would mean that essentially in industries and in sectors across the sectors, we would win bargaining rights or a set of standards. So sectoral bargaining is a real thing being talked about right now, and it's a huge political lift of how that would happen, but there's real work being done to figure that out. The second would be the idea of worker governance. So again, not something that's a norm in the United States, but what could work councils and worker governance look like, and what can we learn from Sweden? And then the third, this is connected to sectoral bargaining, but fundamentally our labor laws in the US need to answer 3 questions. One, who has the ability to bargain? Because right now, it's exclusionary. So how can we make it inclusionary? So if you work, you have the ability to bargain. 2, what are you bargaining over? In US labor law, it's very narrow what you're allowed to bargain and negotiate over. Yet we know workers' lives are beyond work. And so how can we, I use the teacher strikes as examples, but that's a push towards saying we're not just going to bargain about our wages and conditions, but we're going to bargain about the condition of public education in this country, right? And thirdly, who are we bargaining with? More often than not, most workers in this country are trying to negotiate with the wrong entity that isn't the actual decision maker. As more and more private equity firms are actually the final decision makers, there's questions about understanding who fundamentally has decision-making power, and therefore, who are we actually negotiating with? So the promise is there's a lot of really good reform ideas that actually will be coming out in the next few months, where some of the vision of what's possible will be laid out. But there's really good work happening in the labor law sector. And just one more word on cultural, our friends from All My Friends Are Stars. I love that. And I would just say, I believe that we need to actually support the development of a whole new cultural framework around work. I believe something new is trying to be born. And actually many young people in the US context are demanding that work be different. And if we actually take the time to listen and hear that, we could actually help support through art and culture to change the narrative, change the environment, and culture in such a way that some of our visions of what's possible is possible. But without a cultural strategy, we fall back into right versus left.
So this isn't a new conversation that we're having. 1961, John F. Kennedy gave a speech and called the major domestic challenge of the 60s. What he defined as the major domestic challenge of the 60s was to maintain full employment at a time when automation, of course, is replacing men. So we've been having this debate for a while. We'll continue to have this debate. David, your book is such an excellent, well-needed contribution, and I'm not just saying this since I work at the foundation, to this debate that I don't think previously existed. So I encourage you to get your copy in the back. David, you will be able to sign people's copy in the back, right? We'll have you standing outside in the foyer. Take an opportunity, you all can stay a little bit, I hope, to take personal questions from people, because I know a lot of people might want to come up and ask the longer than one sentence version of the question. So you're welcome to do that.
Sorry, so there are no more questions?
I'm going to let you come. I think we should end so that you guys can come ask personal questions to them.
So I think there's a really, please forgive me, I'm not one of these people. But I do want to bring up, there's a very important aspect of this that I want to ask this for everyone to consider, which is that there is some concern on the part of parent organizations. We can't exclude from the work success, evaluating the success of work models in any country, how it affects children. And there is a Swedish organization called HARO. There is a book called Are the Kids All Right in Daycare? 90% of Swedish children between 18 months old and school age are in full-time daycare. And there are documented concerns that there are developmental problems with that. And I feel compelled that I have to bring it up, because I'm noticing that there's no contrarian voice or even any voice we haven't said the word child in here, and yet many workers will be parents or aunts or uncles. So, and even the photo in the promotional brochure has a mother and a child, presumably. So so the question is, why isn't anyone bringing up that aspect of the workforce success, and that there are documented concerns about it, and let's see how we can overcome that, or at least acknowledge it if we're not sure what to do about it, because the concerns for child development for Swedish children are real. And HARO is one of the organizations, the Swedish organizations, that cares about it. The tax system in Sweden does actually penalize people who choose to care for their own children full time. These are all things that we have to discuss.
I'm glad you brought it up. Now we're got a whole new discussion that we should totally have, but we'll have to let it be another discussion, because we do have to go. But you're bringing in that there's so many different. It's all in the book. There is actually some chapters on childcare in the book too, but there's so many different layers and richness and depth to this and sides to this to bring up, that I thank you for that too. But we should come talk to David after. Please come talk to him. Get your book signed. I need to give a special thanks here before you all sneak away, to the Consul General of Sweden. And the American Scandinavian Foundation, for Tor Bonnier and the Karl-Adam Bonnier Foundation, to Business Sweden, and of course to you all for being here. And the conversation has to keep going, so come talk to David and let's talk about all these other things in the debate too. So thanks, guys.